Hello everyone and welcome to the SaaS Playbook. Today I have a new and exciting guest joining us, Nick King, who is from Kinetic. Today we're going to touch the highly regulated nature of the industry and the future of AI. Hi Nick and welcome to the SaaS Playbook.
Thanks Claire, it's great to be here. We met a little while ago, so when you gave me this chance to come join you today, I was pretty excited about it. So hopefully it's beneficial for the listeners and we can tackle a few interesting topics along the way.
Wonderful. So let's start then, Nick, with your journey to Kinetic. Would you like to give us a brief summary of how you started the company and what the company's about?
Yeah, so Kinetic really serves as an R&D project that kind of came out of about 4 or 5 years ago. We were really looking at transfer learning and how we could take corpuses of knowledge and apply them to very specific applied decision making. So when we think about decision making, we're thinking about complex systems in oil and gas or pharmaceutical decisions. So decisions that you cannot get wrong but have immense amounts of data. And I should probably go a little bit into my background where I worked for a company called DataRobot, Microsoft, Google, VMware, Cisco, and it had consulted to a number of DoD and companies before that. And so my whole career has really been around large data, complex platform architectures. And for me, the fascination has always been, after you get over speeds and feeds, is like the point of all this stuff is to make a decision. And so before LLMs blew up, we knew that there was possibility for these transformers to really inform decision making. And I think along the way, we've probably all heard about hallucinations and is AI going to make stuff up? We really focus on making decisions with the support of this knowledge and other techniques so that we can make a decision and not hallucinate, or the hallucinations are by design. So that's a little bit of what we do. We're predominantly in pharmaceutical and in government use cases today, a little bit of oil and gas and energy as well.
Wonderful. You've got a deep background with companies like Microsoft and Google. How did your experience at those tech giants shape the company's mission?
I grew up in New Zealand and I was working there and working on mainframes and other bits and pieces, which there weren't many in New Zealand. And then one day I was at Microsoft and they said, hey, you want to come and work on this thing called virtualization? We think it might be a thing. And a month later I lived in Redmond, and that was 20 years ago. And so I think I spent 10 years all in at Microsoft and got to see multiple transitions, right? From, Windows being accepted as an operating system for the enterprise to virtualization to big data tier one. And then I went to this company called Google. At the time, there was no cloud business. I was in the first, 14, 15 people of the cloud business. Larry and Sergey tried to shut it down at least 3 times while I was there, and I was working on a technology called Dremel, which became MapReduce. And so I moved from Seattle to California to avoid being sued by Microsoft because Washington State has weird laws. Microsoft is probably the strategic playbook, I think, of any large organization. Bill and Steve doesn't get enough credit for it, and certainly Satya, very strategic in the way it operates. We would have so much ability to play out multiple scenarios, and whereas Microsoft would strategically play its way out of a scenario, Google had this way of engineering its way out of its problems. And so wild things we would build. There's one technology we worked on called Spanner, which was the ability to having a globally distributed real-time database around the world, way ahead of its time, still around. And so, I just got to work on some really fascinating technical problems at Google. So 2 very different ways of solving problems. I think it took a lot away from those, but also, how to build businesses with technology, right? Like technology for technology's sake is not what pays the bills, and people get bored. And so I spent a lot of time looking at how to get, it sounds funny now, how to get mobility into the enterprise. And email was the killer app. And then I went to VMware and Cisco and DataRobot and other folks since then. And it's been lots of life lessons, and lots of people that I've worked with, have been able to teach me a lot of stuff as well. And I think watching this AI wave that we're in now, a lot of the lessons that go all the way back to, mobility and cloud are replaying again now. So it's a privilege. It helps guide me, I think, to stay sane.
Yeah.
But it also keeps me grounded in being skeptical of the value that what something says to you, but then being able to apply that to actually do something meaningful. Because that's ultimately what pays the bills. That's ultimately what we get up for. We don't all get up to build slide decks to talk about what we might do. We actually want to do something, I think.
Yeah. I can't imagine there are too many people that have both those big names down as companies that they've worked with or for, and then the learnings that you must have taken. And like you say, they would have done things very differently. So to have the mixture of the two together, I should imagine that's pretty good to have under your belt.
Yeah, it's hard, but I think I was lucky to see both of those companies go through big transitions, right? And I left when Steve was going to leave about a year before everyone knew, and so we knew he was leaving, so all the products were being held back for Satya so he could launch them. And so I was basically sitting around waiting for you to start, and I met the Google guys at this conference called Strata, which isn't around anymore, and that began the discussion for me to go over and work with them. And so, I think you'd be surprised how small a group of how once you kind of experience it and you know it, and it's the same people you kind of bump into, and there's you kind of meet these people that are solving hard problems in the industry, and 5 years later they're still pushing the boundaries, they're still pushing.
Yeah.
And so I think that when you reach a lot of those organizations, you're also trying to solve some of these really hard problems, but you also get to experience the drag of big organizations and politics and news, and so I think there's a good balance there.
Yeah.
Probably the one thing you take for granted is you can always get a meeting. So if you ring up and say, hey, it's Nick from Microsoft, usually people will let you have a meeting. And when you go, hey, it's Nick from Data Kinetic, they're like, okay, dude, you better impress me in the next 7 seconds. So I think that there is a false sense of you get from those companies. But yes. I think, try and stay humble and deliver people value as fast as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Data Kinetic focuses on data systems and platforms, but particularly in a regulated environment and obviously critical spaces. How do you define decision intelligence or applied AI in the context of your work?
Yeah, so we do primarily focus on regulated. It's a couple reasons for that. One is those tend to be high stakes industries just by design, right? So that's why there is regulation. Something that most people don't realize is that it's also an advantage to have a regulation because there are certain constraints that exist around that industry, right? And so when we look at these decision models, we know that those are regulated because, people could be hurt or harmed, or there could be some negative consequences from it. But those are also rules we know to be mostly true, right? Whereas in retail and unregulated industries, people can do some wild stuff and there's no repercussions unless they get caught, right? In regulated, there's actually sort of this, it sort of sounds counterintuitive, but the constraints actually make it slightly more predictable for us to understand the environment. It gives us an external control. And then the other reason for regulated was that, because there is lineage of decisions, right? I discover an oil target. I then go do the geo surveys. I then go start the drilling, and I then produce the hydrocarbons, and I then process it. We get these wonderful time arcs that we can track. So there's sort of this exhaust of regulatory data, which is why we chose regulatory. One, because we knew it would be hard, but two, because we knew there would be data for us to train from.
Yeah.
And I think people are often quite surprised to hear that rationale of why we chose regulatory, and it's because of that. So the second part of the question, what is decision intelligence? For us, when we look at the decisions that get made, there's sort of the platform piece. And, we used to joke that platforms was just an excuse for 80% of the product being done, and that, the customer or partner would fill it in. And there's some truth to that. And I used to watch as everyone would try and, make the platform their own and do all this stuff. And we'd all fight about it, and there's lots of competition. And I'd watch these customers bewildered as they're like, dude, I just need to solve this QBR I have today, or we just need to submit this thing. And so there was a whole other ecosystem just designed to make sense of the platform ecosystem. And I think from my own experience, I realized that businesses are really made up of a couple things. They're what I would call key ceremonies, decision ceremonies. So let's choose a QBR, right? We've all sat in a QBR. We spend the night before making sure the slides are right and make sure that Bob's not throwing us under the bus so that we can go into the QBR, and I'm on the other side of the QBR trying to make sure if I'm making the right decision and if that guy's lying to me or what's going on. We know it's a ceremony, and it's important because what a QBR really is are rules and state. What I mean by that is there are a series of rules, explicit or implicit. The explicit rules are, here are your sales targets, and you shouldn't sell this to these countries, and you should price this way and blah. And the implicit rules are another set of rules which says, we shouldn't sell in this market because this competitor does this. We should position slightly different in this market versus this market, and therefore that means they're going to sell this way, right? There's rules. And then on the other side, there is the state. Are we green, yellow, red? Let's keep it real simple.
Yes.
So really a QBR, when you boil it down, is a whole set of rules organized by teams with their slight explicit, implicit, and then they're communicating, am I red or green? And then my job is to look at all of that collective status update and be like, does this mean we're going to reach our target? That's really what a QBR is. If you think about it kind of abstract away. Now, that ceremony is really a decision, right? The decision is how to move forward. Technically, I say there's only 2 QBRs in a year because Q1 is always Q5, right? Because you've never got your plan to market. You talk about your strategy in December, you launch it in January. Well, you're already halfway through Q1, so you're just going to keep the same Q4 playbook running through. So Q1 is Q5, so that's that's not really a QBR, that's a launch of the strategy.
Yeah.
Q2 QBR, which is really, okay, now we know what we're actually doing, here's what we need to change, so you renegotiate and close the year. You get your Q3 QBR, which is really about making sure you land Q4, and Q4, which is really about closing the year, which has nothing to do with your strategy at all. So that means you only have 2 true decision points in the year if you believe in QBRs as a strategy. So now we understand that. Why do I define decision intelligence? Well, if we can have AI understand the ontology of the decision, understand what makes up the state, how do we define red or green state of these rules? We can then statistically calculate what would a QBR look like if we understood everyone's rules. And then that now creates this sort of depth of data, actually including like the different market shifts that we could effectively run daily. So imagine getting your QBR data up to date daily, but also being able to react to other decisions made in the business. So now as opposed to 2 decision points, let's just say we do it once a week.
Yeah.
So we know January's already washed. Okay, we'll keep it simple. We've now only got, 48 decisions left in the year. We know that Christmas waits, so now let's say we've got 40 decisions in a year, and let's say we take half of those and just don't even make decisions. We're now making 20 decisions a year, like key decisions versus 2. How much more effective would that business be?
Wow.
Right?
Amazing.
And so what decision intelligence is the sort of understanding of what drives a decision to be made, an actual outcome, not a dashboard, but an outcome. And then how do you then take that understanding and power those changes? And the numbers, the sort of exponential delta between 2 versus 20 is significant. And then the beauty is we can actually even tell you, you made this decision and these were the results. This is how your competitor reacted. So we actually can start to simulate decisions, which is the other side of the decision intelligence coin.
Wow. So it's an enhancement plus some.
Yeah, I mean, the way to think of, I'll give you another example. Imagine you have 2 employees, and one employee is great at getting paid on time, and the other one is great at getting discounts. And they have the exact same process. Why is that, right? And it might just be that one of them has a calendar reminder to call twice, and the other one might just get really angry towards the end of the call. Who knows? But if you could understand the dimensions that made that would change the way you design your system. Now, if you don't think of those factors for decisions, you would just do the standard thing. It was like, okay, here's our playbook, and Mary's not as good as Bob, or Bob's not as good as Mary. But maybe with decision intelligence, you start to get much better at sort of being able to break out these decisions for much better results. And business intelligence, you can stare at 1,000 dashboards and make no decisions. Decision intelligence say, here's how you make these decisions more often, more accurately. And ideally, here's what will happen when you make this decision. Yeah,
so it's almost giving feedback on those decisions. And is it like agentic AI that then it's learning from what those decisions that have been made for the next decision?
Yeah. So we work primarily in pharmaceutical, right? And so I'll give you an example. We've got this wonderful new molecule. It fixes, it modifies a disease in such a way that we're going to have a much better life. We know it's going to change this particular market. So we'll understand who are the healthcare providers that will want to know about this molecule. Who are the patients? What is their profile? How will the regulators and markets respond to that? Way of communicating that to them. What is the labels of you and your competitors? Where is the best phenotype?
Yeah.
We can do that to a level where we're like, the best place for us to recruit and explain this medication is not by TV advertising, but by actually, creating the study that can show how these things work together. And we know that will, help educate more folks, but also, the overall burden or disease burden of this will change the profile of this market.
Yeah.
And so all of that stuff I just rattled off is usually many, many studies and a lot of work. And so we can compress that into a decision and understand and make that all available and say, okay, here's our considerations. And then when you can do that, what the other thing we'll do is we can just go try a what if. What if we just decide to launch just this indication versus both indications at once? What would that do to the market? And so, there's a lot of what if analysis. If I kept asking you to rewrite me a new plan every night, you'd probably quit, right? Like, Nick, this is the 5th time you've asked me to change strategy. I literally have thrown away complete strategies with the AIs and made them all do it all again. I don't get any complaints. They go do it. Sometimes they get a little sideways and I, tell them off, but they go again. And so I think what it means for us humans is not that AI is coming for our jobs, but all that burdensome pain we feel when our boss says, hey, can you just slice this that way? You're like, oh, dude, that sounds easy, but it's not. Now, we take care of all that work, and then you can say, well, what if we just tried that, right? And that allows you to kind of apply strategic thinking and kind of build out these plans with a lot more confidence.
Yeah.
But you can try the crazy ideas without having to, distract the whole team for a month.
Yeah. Because you noted there that some of the decisions involve life or death consequences, which is a stark difference from many other tech sectors, right? So how does the high stakes environment influence your approach to the data governance, model accuracy, and the ethical deployment of AI?
Yeah. Look, I think every step we always have sort of a adversary or contrarian step to everything we do, right? So at each progressive step forward of like a decision, we'll say this is what we think has made the decision and here is the data behind it. So that all comes with it. And then there comes a whole swarm of agents that say you're wrong, and tries to basically fight with them. And the reason we do that is that sometimes it wins and sometimes it loses. So then we can, one, track the adversarial conditions, but two, often we'll find gaps in the data that the data didn't even know exist, right? And so there's always gaps and biases, and so that actually becomes part of the lineage. And I think sometimes we misrepresent risk as this word. Everything is risky, right? Breathing air is risky. Eventually you'll oxidize and that will kill you, right? Risk is really exposure and control or mitigations. And so we always look at what is the exposure of this decision, what are the mitigations, and have we given the people that are making decisions the right understanding of what's going on. And if you look at what most bad decisions, it's not because they didn't have the data or they didn't know that this would happen, it's that there's usually a collection of things that have compounded for a bad decision, right? People don't generally go out there and try to do bad things, but they miss something. And so what we try to do is at that point of decision, one, you can always audit it, but try and produce just the right amount so that you can make the calculated decision. What are my exposures and what are my mitigations, and make a strategic call. And so that's how we balance it. I mean, we are constantly evolving our data that we collect. We constantly look at it differently. We're always making new friends with new data sets. And I think beginning to really work with these decision makers to figure out what it is they need, and actually now going back to source data from places we didn't think were sources before to sort of support those decisions. So that's the sort of first half of your question.
Yeah.
And the second half is how do we reconcile and manage that? I mean, we surround ourselves with the experts. We're skeptical of everything. I think it's very real. Like I was in Scottsdale this weekend with a robotic heart surgeon, and I was in the OR, and it becomes very real what you're doing when you're seeing someone on the operating table, right? And I'm right there with them, and so you suddenly realize that the numbers on the screen are meaningful. And so I think, that bridge from mathematical to the reality of sitting in an OR this weekend brings it home. And then just the look in surgeons' faces when, our data is showing them stuff that they can actually understand and work with. And I think that feedback loop gives us the courage and the confidence to do it, but the respect and humility to, question everything we do. And that's the balance.
That's amazing, and I would have thought the job satisfaction in seeing something like that must be amazing. This isn't your usual tech scenario, is it, to see something that's actually saving lives?
Yeah, I think there's always the ability to improve someone's life with how much time you save, and it's very different. Fortunately, one of the patients this weekend, was a doctor, right? So usually that means you can have a very different conversation than with someone that's not. And I was talking to him
Yes.
pre-operatively and about what we were doing, and I saw him a day later, and he was chatting again, and so I think that makes it very human and real. I think, shout out to the medical professionals out there that just, they sacrifice a lot to do it, and if we can just, move some of this so that, research can move faster, or an operative approach can reduce post-operative AFib, or we can change the way we think of AFib pre-operatively, and that can save lives and, change the way people's experience of those surgeries is. I think that's a little win for overall and everything, but I think it's a huge win for those individuals, and I think, we try not to get too over the top with it, right? We stay humble.
No.
We're not actually the doctors, we're just supporting them.
No, but I think it's all important. My son has a medical condition that, he will live with the rest of his life. So I can only hope that things like this helps the progression of cures and different things that will help him and everyone else who might have these critical illnesses that they're living with long term. So yeah, it's good to know that things like data is just as important.
Yeah, I mean, I am amazed at just the speed of which we are learning stuff. It was just, just over the weekend, there was a whole paper on twins, one with multiple sclerosis, one without, and then what was the cause of that, and whether it was genetic and what have you. And they found that it was a pair of microbiome was the key commonality for 70-something% of the cases, and not the genetic, sequencing of these patients. And so, just the shift that a biome combination could, be a pre-indication for MS, which is an immune condition.
Yeah.
Suddenly you have changes the whole way you think about it, and we're seeing this every week. We're speeding up like this, right? And I think they can only give hope, and I think we're seeing the FDA and the EMA begin to really change the way they think about how to approve these drugs, right? We don't need to test on 100 chimpanzees to make sure we don't need to do that anymore. It's poor old chimpanzees, and we don't need eagles. We don't need that. We can do that, and then we can maintain the data over time. And I think, but it comes responsibility with those shifting regulations, right? And I think we are seeing a clear effort to move the way we think of these interventions and the development of these drugs and procedures to make them more accessible, but also make them safer. And I think there's a better understanding now that, it's not like we just have our individual organs that are separate, right? The heart is not separate from the rest of the body. The stomach is more related to things than we think. And so there's all these things going on, and so we're starting to think more holistically about the systems as well. So, yeah, I think it's very possible we will see, 100-year-old humans pretty soon. I joke with my friends that we've all got to try to live to 100, so then we can actually, live to 400 by porting our brains to AI. But right now, I don't know if we'll all make it to 100. So, I think we're right on the cusp of that longevity barrier going further.
Yeah. The nursing homes are going to need to open up a bit more and have a bit more space for people coming through.
Yeah, or people can be more active, right? So the nursing homes, maybe they're just social experiences with, water parks attached to them. And so I think the way we look at aging has to change a little bit as well.
Yeah, and technology, I've spoken to somebody in the medtech world where they're now putting a lot more into the elderly's homes with collating data when this person is getting up, when they're going to bed, when they're going for food, and it's collecting data so they know what time the carers need to go in, if that person's had a fall. Everything is, again, driven by the data that they're collecting.
Yeah. I mean, humans are social creatures, right? And so getting them up and out of their chair to walk around and do something, I think there was a study somewhere, I've got to figure out where it was, but they had old people talking to robots, which sounds really cruel, but the old people loved it. The robots were funny, and they, and they're singing along. I was like, what is this dystopian future? But the reality was that they reacted really positively to it.
Because it's keeping their minds active, isn't it?
Yeah, and I had another friend who, worked in insurance, and he would literally have a bus pick people up to take them through for their, care. And he said the bus was the most interesting part for these folks. And I know that sounds kind of, a little facetious, but it's true. People need reaction, and as you get older, that's harder and harder to have. And so I think maybe we should rethink old people's homes and turn them into, a whole bunch of hot tubs and some other nice stuff for them, right? And who knows what trouble they'll get into.
I know. My friends and I have a pact that we're going to go in one together, and we're going to cause chaos.
Yeah. So,
But
kudos to them. Let them have the fun.
Exactly. Data Kinetic prides itself on being platform agnostic, so working across Snowflake, Databricks, various cloud providers. Why is flexibility crucial for your clients, and what competitive advantage does that give Data Kinetic?
Yeah, so, a lot of folks ask why are we platform agnostic. Part of it is that we really want our customers to work with what they're comfortable in. And to be honest, they usually are, right? They're regulated. So there is an element of they're like, well, you come to us. And so, we didn't want to force them to switch cloud vendors. We just wanted them to choose what they had. And we wanted the cloud vendors to know that, we are able to support them no matter which way they go. And I think underneath it, we are very focused on simplicity and kind of these, great engineering is sometimes very simple, smart ideas done elegantly versus lots and lots of code. And as people are vibe coding, thousands of lines, we really focus on, how do we get this to work very efficiently? If it works efficiently, we can audit it, we can trust it, it's not a black box. And so part of the reason we're agnostic is a lot of the stuff we have to be able to open it up and explain it. And we have to deeply understand it. And to be honest, a lot, 4 or 5 of the things we do, they are unique approaches to solving problems that, we've just picked up over 20 years of doing this. And so, so it's just some of that stuff we just couldn't put in platforms. But I think the final piece is that, it gives our customers the ability to choose something. So if they have their data in Databricks instead of their BI teams are in Snowflake, we can connect to both. We don't have to munge it in the middle, which means, they don't feel like we're forcing them. And I think nothing's more distasteful to a customer than when you're like, well, I can't work on them because they're my competitor. And I used to hate that. So I'm like, look, I don't care what you use. Everyone's our friend. Use what you want. Here's how we do it. And I think people are in genuine disbelief. Would it be better for me to focus on one and have them? I'm sure they'd tell me yes. But I think for the customer, they ultimately want to not be told what it is.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I think would limit some clients only using one. It's going to limit you and the business as well as limiting the clients. Yeah. So I think it's really good that you can be agnostic in that way.
Yeah. We have this term data gravity. So we always look at where the most amount of data is and we try and build around that. If you sort of think about it, it does have this effect. The biggest app will collate more apps to it. And so you do have this concept of data gravity. And wherever that exists, we don't want to try and create our own gravity, because what happens is over a year's time, that team will absorb your team. And so we try and attach to that. There is some theory around, how do we evolve with the decisions and how do we make sure we can create decisions the best for that outcome. And so we look for the gravity. So being by platform agnostic, we're not trying to build our own island. We're just sort of connecting straight to where the decisions are happening.
Yeah. And I know I've discussed with you previously about obviously a large part of my experiences within banking. And I know we discussed the challenges with regional banks at what they face with KYC, so your customer, and AML. So how are your models being applied to find anomalies and manage the increasing complexity of state-specific regulations in these areas?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple ways of slicing this, right? So first, the regulations are changing, not just federally, but also, I think, in state. Probably the one that I watch, right now there's this forfeit of assets for without KYC attached in California for crypto, which, we'll see how that goes. I think that's June 1. But I think also, if you look at how we think about money and how you think about payments and identity theft and what have you, KYC is as much a protection for the customer as it is for the provider, right? And so, we can argue about, all the different things around crypto and what have you. But I think at the end of the day, if my parents had a bank account, I'd want them to be able to, get their money and people not to be able to take their money. if I just put it
Yes.
in really simple terms. And so I think what we're seeing is a couple things, right? The way that we detect behavior patterns that may mean they're not our customer have evolved dramatically. 5-6 years ago, we would look to see if the mouse moved in a human way. And so, there's a very human arc that exists to how you click and a very machine arc for how that is. And then, eventually people figured out how to do that. And we would look at the tempo of how you type in stuff to the keyboard. You have a very particular tempo. So we were getting very clever sort of these large language models on detecting outlier patterns. And what we found with these large language models, which was fascinating, is that they also have a very good ability to zero-shot label. And which means that without any training, we could say, look at these transactions and tell us ones look good or bad. And with a little bit of fine-tuning, they were very good at detecting if this looks like a bad transaction or a good transaction. And our theory of it is because they're trained on such vast amounts of data corpus that the distribution is available, and then we're able to sample those distributions to synthetically represent it. So we're actually able to get a very good depth of, good. We always joke hot dog, not hot dog. What we're usually saying is good or bad. And so we've got very good at building these models to be very fast at identifying and labeling. And so you can have several different regimes on top of that, and then before you know it, you've now got a real-time scoring system with a bunch of small language models that create these very sophisticated fraud or AML which anti-money laundering or KYC type tools. So I think, every time we make a step forward there, the bad guys make a step forward the other way. We see our first AI attacks back the other way now. But I think for my parents, who I think of, I want them to be safe, I think that it's getting better at making sure they don't do. And so that's who I think about when I think of KYC.
Yeah.
I don't think about, the edge. And so I think that's where we're seeing these models be quite powerful. And I think later on, how they seek assistance, right? So usually it's bad actors calling them up, right, and saying, hey, you haven't got paid this bill, can you give me your birth date? And then that's usually how people are losing stuff now. And so I think the more we can kind of make those types of attacks and support my parents, as a broad thing, help that sort of stuff be intercepted, I think will also be safer, because that's really where bad people take advantage of things.
Yeah,
So,
my granddad got scammed. They called him up and said that they were from the Inland Revenue and they were investigating the bank, and they needed him to withdraw a large amount of money so that they could check the notes, the codes on the notes. And he did it. The bank asked all the right questions. What did he need the money for? They told him, tell them you're buying a car. And they went to his house and took the money.
wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to, come find those people for you
Yeah.
and visit. Yeah, look, I think I hate people like that.
Yeah.
But luckily this is recorded, or I would have gone in a very different talk track to hear that something had happened like that. But I think for me, those that prey on people's good nature, I think we're getting much better at being able to intercept that, right? And it's been education, but I will tell you, for fun sometimes, when they call me up and my name is this thing, I'll try waste their time, right? And so I have got one to sing with me, Phil Collins, for about 10 minutes before eventually he gave up, and he was not so stoked with me. But he played along for the first bit, because I think he was so surprised that someone would start chatting with him. By the time we got in the, I can feel it coming in the ear tonight, I think he'd had it. But, sometimes I'm just coding, and it's fun just to waste someone's time while I'm they came to waste my time, well, I'm going to waste their time. And that's just one less old lady that's getting attacked, or, your granddad.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess moving on to real ID and biometrics. How do you see AI and data systems evolving to solve the ongoing challenges of identity verification and fraud detection, especially in the financial sector, in the next 3 to 5 years?
The reason why I'm pausing this is such a complicated subject. So, look, I think there's it's like, when does this get used and how does this identify you? Here in the US, they have everything on me, right? So there's nothing I can hide. But for me, I worked at Google. There's nothing that's secret anymore, right? And I'm very comfortable with that. And you could track me through Ancestry.com and find my DNA splice on 23andMe. And, you know, so I think some of it is we've got to realize that, you know, data exhaust is everywhere. And even without us opting into Real ID, I could pretty much figure out who you were. You know, it's very hard to be off system, right?
Yeah.
And so then the next question is like, okay, well, how do you on system something that makes sense and that gives you the right protection? And I think, you know, there needs to be a sliding scale of acceptable understanding, right? And it needs to be consistent. And what I worry about today is we're sort of use one thing as an excuse to give the other, and the level of understanding or sort of fingerprinting or kind of, you know, layering needs to be in relationship, and it's becoming politicized, and I worry that, you know, there should be a reasonable scale for where this gets used, right? And where that data should come together, and we should be able to track our data. I think the EU means well, you know, right to be forgotten, but all it did was it gave us this forget all cookies button, and you know, it hasn't really changed if the internet's safer or not, and so, but I do think there is this requirement for us to understand how we own our data. And I think, you know, if we don't pay for the product, we are the product. And I think that worries me when you see identity being required and Real ID becoming the requirement for employment, and that becomes the requirement for your access to get a mortgage. Like, yes, there should all be that, but then there's sort of, at what point does something else get connected to that, right? Like, did you pay your parking fines and now you can't check into your flight? I think there's a, you know, if you look at China, it's a very scary concept where, like, you end up with these very arbitrary rules applied to a system. And so for me, you know, I kind of like the disorganization that exists and the ability for us to negotiate with it a little bit. But, you know, for my parents, what would I want for them? I think there should be an appropriate level of, you know, protections, but not so far that they can't get their pensions if they forget to pay the registration for their car.
No, totally agree. It has to be some level of almost sensibility, isn't it? It's can't just be used for anything. I know when we spoke before, I'd mentioned that I'm seeing that some larger companies are only just now starting to introduce agentic AI into its processes. I think you've got some who are obviously doing very well and have probably been doing it for a number of years, but I think some have had that reluctance of putting it in too soon. So why do you think many established companies are late to the advanced AI journey, and what bottlenecks do they typically face?
Yeah, so it's funny you should mention that, because, you know, one of the side things we're working on is actually a book we're calling the AI Skeptic, specifically for these people.
Okay.
And the reason we started with the AI Skeptic is we're like, well, why are these people skeptical of AI? And I was like, well, they should be. They're actually being good leaders by not just going and trying this thing straight away. They wanted to see what was possible. At the same time, you know, there are organizational changes and shifts that have to happen, right? We've done stuff a certain way, we're very successful, we've got responsibility to shareholders. You know, a lot of these organizations, they have to make these decisions like, do I go buy a bunch of compute or do I buy 20 more trucks? Right? I'd say go buy the trucks, you know. And so there's this element of, like, they have to make these decisions in such a way where the risk, the exposures and mitigations make sense for the outcomes. And I think 2 years ago, you couldn't responsibly as a leader be like, I'm just going to bet the farm on this chatbot thingy. And most good leaders are like, yeah, it's a chatbot. Like, you know, and I think the balance has to be, and what we're seeing now why these big organizations are starting to look at it, is that, you know, there is a desire to make more than 2 decisions a year at these QBRs, right? But there's never been the ability to organize the resources to enable that. And I think there's a changing view on, like, where is people's time best spent, and how do they look at that, and where do shareholders and customers see the most value, and how do we deliver that? And I think on the other side, there's also this fear, and this is a very real fear that should exist, which is, at what point is the breakout velocity of my competitors so exponential I could never catch them? And what I mean by that is, you know, I look at my own developer productivity in terms of sort of scaled human hours versus machine hours, right? So I take the number of hours my AIs have worked, and then there's an algo that makes them less efficient each month, so it's not like a compounding scale, but it forces the models to get better. And so on average, we're somewhere between 700 to 1,000 human hours a day in development, research, what have you. So like that's my daily AI approach. Let's just say 50% is just words, and so half of it is useful, and 20% gets put into something that goes to a customer.
Yeah.
All right, so that's now 200 hours a day. There are 2,000 billable hours in a year. So in one day, I'm doing a tenth of a year. So what happens if I work for 200 days? So you can see that even if I'm only taking advantage of 10% of that output, there is a point where I could be 5, 10, 20 years ahead of you. Right? And that's why you're seeing such a huge amount of money being put into these data centers, why there's such a big concern about China, and why as businesses, we can no longer just be like, well, I should buy 20 trucks. You should buy 19 trucks and begin to look at what that one truck could do and understand small, boring solutions that have output first, and then take that small, boring problem, and usually they become more interesting problems. And so that's what I say to people, like, take the thing everyone hates to do because they won't complain when you take it away from them, and something as simple as like scanning invoices becomes a dynamic pricing solution because we can see all that data in real time. And before, it just went into an ERP and you're like, oh, good, billing's done. We're now like, well, what if we dynamically price discounts based on your overall cash flow, your inventory rate, what we see the distribution is based on tariffs, and we do it dynamically. And I think that added like $6-7 million to this business just on changing the discount rates dynamically.
Wow.
So that's a really boring problem, entering pricing and adjusting pricing, turned into net positive $7 million.
Wow.
So that's where I think a lot of these businesses, they just couldn't see the value in how to do that. And so I think now it really is not about the first 90% of the problem, which is where everyone focused the last couple of years. People want the last 10% of the problem solved. I can have all the fancy chatbots and everything else, but what I really want is that pricing structure so I can make $7 million more. And that's the last 10% of the problem. That's why a lot of projects fail. They get that 90%, they forgot that there's a 10% that exists, which is getting it to production. And that's really where we focus, is that 10%.
That end goal.
Mm-hmm. That's the hard part, unfortunately. I wish it was easier, but... So that gives you a sort of a good, why are people so skeptical? Why do we focus there? But I think it gives you a good idea of why decision intelligence is so powerful when you're on top of these agents and AIs. And no one really asks me that much about our models anymore. They used to all the time. I think we still talk about the models we build sometimes, but I try and steer them higher up the stack now. It's like, what are the decisions we're trying to make? And if only we knew this, or where are the key inflection moments of our business? And focusing on that, like it's a language and an ownable moat that they can own as a business.
Yeah.
For me, I worry that if you give your business to Claude or OpenAI, and then it's suddenly, we're so much more efficient, we can just fire these people, like, at what point does someone else figure that out, or OpenAI figures that out? And so I really encourage people to own something, right? Own that innovation, learn that. Because otherwise, if you're just outsourcing it to this thing, at your own risk. And people don't talk about this enough. And I think just last week, Satya started talking about this idea of ownable moats and ownable IP. And I think he was very astute to start to call it out. And I think he's right. People need to own their innovation. And even if it's hard now, imagine if in 3 years' time you crack it and now you're 10 years ahead of your competitors.
Yeah.
So that's probably what I would say to those folks. And they didn't get to that position without some hard work, so I believe in them.
Yeah. And I know when I've spoken to somebody else previously, their thought was AI won't replace people as a whole, but what you'll find is people will have multiple roles. So they'll be wearing multiple hats because AI is helping them, I guess, juggle multiple different roles at the same time because of the efficiencies that it brings, which I thought was kind of a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think that we still are figuring out the right level for which we can insert AI into our lives, right? And I would be on the extreme case of that. But I think at the same time, it's like if you just let AI take stuff over, eventually everything ends up with M dashes and it becomes the same slop. So how do you maintain your alpha while getting the acceleration? And what I found is that comes from becoming really specific and detailed in specific problems and using those to develop, which means that I don't know necessarily that people say, now I'm a CEO of this AI team of everything. Maybe it's like I'm currently researching how to do, anti-money laundering in the Australian market, and I just become a real expert in those patterns. And then I go do something else. And so I feel like humans can create in white space where the machines don't seem to be able to do that. And, you know, I think that the advantage comes from being able to build in that white space and then have the AI kind of fill it in so it doesn't end up sounding all the same. Because ultimately, if you delegate everything to AI, then where's your value if AI is just the same for everybody else? So that's kind of how I would look at it. You know, I don't think humans are toast, but I do think that for a lot of people, it's going to feel very uncomfortable to go from, you know, doing a 9 to 5 and being very predictable to feeling like they have to produce this white space. And I think the way that kids are educated now, and I think the way we think of systems and everything else, there is this uncomfort that's coming, right? Where it's like you have to figure out the answer. Today, usually it's like we're told the answer, or you learn the answer. There's not this pressure put to feel uncomfortable of not knowing. And so, you know, some of the best people that we hire are ones that just thrive. Sometimes they're on the spectrum. That's the space they want to be in. They want to be in the uncomfortable. I think that's the bit I worry about is people are going to have to learn to feel uncomfortable again. And those that reject that, I think, will struggle to differentiate. Whereas before, we just didn't have enough, you know, you couldn't AI a certain job, but we could soon. And so that's probably a whole other ethical discussion on, you know, how do we teach those new behaviors and what will that look like?
Yeah. So let's now look at what is the most exciting application of agentic AI or decision intelligence that you are currently seeing or developing, and how do you anticipate that it will disrupt the traditional consulting model?
Most exciting and how we disrupt. Well, for me, I look at knowledge work and consultants. And I think it's very important what they do. And everyone's like, oh, we're going to disrupt the consultants. And, you know, but for me, I'm like, well, how do I support the consultants and the clients to bring this stuff together? And I think, you know, we use consultants as an insurance policy before, right? Like if I've got this big consulting firm to go and review my stuff, they've gone very deep and they've told me that New York would be better with trash cans. And I actually loved when I first wanted to hate the McKinsey New York trash can study. So I found it and downloaded it just so I could send my friends at McKinsey an email saying how much this was stupid. And then I read the study, and you should find the link. It actually was a really good study. I was like, and I sent it to them. I said, guys, I wanted to hate this because you got paid a couple $1 million to obviously take piles of trash from the streets and put it in trash cans. I see, but you managed to engineer the shit out of this thing to the point where I'm like, this was a very good study. And so, it's available. You'll find it at New York McKinsey trash can study. And like they even figured out the calculus of the parking to the size of the bin to the recycling to the beautiful.
Wow.
Was it worth $N million? I don't know. If we can start to get to the point where that level of decision making is available through both the consultants and companies, then I think that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to I hate the idea of like disrupt. I'm like, you know what? Yes, we'll do it different. But like I want the consultants to get better data from the client. I want the client to be able to ask better questions with the consultant. And like it sounds really funny hearing me say that, but like it's a real struggle to get good data. It's a real struggle to get alignment on what the actual outcome is. That's all defined in this statement of work. No, there's all these things. So that's the first thing I want to disrupt is like, let's just get more intellectual density to get a better outcome, right? And because that way, you know, more decisions can carry more gravity. And then the other thing, the most exciting thing we're working on, you know, I think we've made incredible progress on thinking about the entire life cycle of a drug molecule from before it's even discovered to discovery to, you know, each step. And each of these decisions is very important, but they were treated as isolated decisions. And we've now to the point where we can take an entire molecule's life cycle all the way past it being a generic and then look at what other molecules should we bring into this mix. It's been a long body of work, but probably the last 4 or 5 weeks, we're starting to see the loop connect and it's speeding up. And I think for me that has been incredibly exciting to see that happen. And we're going to launch we're going to spin out the biopharma, the molecule lifecycle from DK after an R&D project to build this specifically and make it available.
Wow.
That has been you know, a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of work and a lot of solving problems that supposedly, you know, have never been changed for 100 years. I, you know, saw the smile on the face of a heart surgeon as we started discussing a preoperative AFib program that we had designed and come up with, and he agreed with it. So something we had built,
Yes.
totally had to come up with a plan to do something with a molecule, and it was credible. And
Yeah.
I think that is pretty amazing, right? And you know, 4 or 5 ideas came off of that.
Wow.
And the fact we've got to that level of fidelity, and we have a long way to go, don't get me wrong, and
Yes.
you know, but that felt pretty good. And I think the look on his face as he's like, wait, what? And you saw him, he's like, I agree. And he actually gave feedback, and it was, I think that is truly pretty amazing to see. So that's probably
That
the
is
most
amazing.
exciting thing.
And how long has that project been in flight for? How long have you been working on that piece?
I mean, we've been involved, I would say probably early COVID is when we started working on some of the pharma problems, but that molecule life cycle, I would say has been, I mean, the research goes back years, but like being
Yeah.
deliberate has probably been about 18 to 24 months of R&D. And
Wow.
it has probably been about 60% of my time. And I think that's not a long time really, but I think you
No.
know, when we get the density of what we're working on and, you know, but I pulls from work we've done over the last 15 or 20 years, but just hardcore on that problem, I would say 2 years.
Wow, it's impressive.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a lot of sleep. I don't have very exciting updates to my family when they're asked what I've been up to this week. But I do think, you know, I think it's worth it.
But totally worth it. So I know you'd also said about the legal sector, and you know that's starting to resemble the complex modelling required that you've seen in pharma. What specific challenges in the legal space is Data Kinetic beginning to address? And what similarities do you see between these two similarly disparate industries?
Yeah. When we look at, you know, industries that are like pharma and have the same complexity and same level of data, I sort of, if you look at law versus drugs, you're like, there couldn't be two more different sets of
No.
documents, right? But I think when we step back a little bit, we're like, okay, how could we enable an organization to more efficiently work within the bounds of the law? And so let's take an M&A transaction, right? So we're a multinational, we're acquiring an aluminum factory in the Philippines, distributed across the world, and so I start it from the US M&A office, it then goes to our London head office, it then goes back into our, you know, APAC region and then to our Philippines lawyer. And we have a meeting every 2 weeks to do updates, right? And I'm in charge of the M&A, so I'm trying to get the deal closed. I've got the cash, we're doing the due diligence. And every 2 weeks we say, okay, everyone, where's it at? Like, okay, I'll go talk to Tammy who will check the Thailand and make sure there's no blocking. And so you think of all that orchestration.
Yeah.
And that means that for my M&A deal, which has to close on June 30th, I have to make sure that every 2 weeks these things are moving. But what is the behavior of humans is that I will make sure that just before that meeting, I have the answer for that question. And that's when you will get the answer for that question. So whilst every 2 weeks I get the update, I could have had that data 1 minute after the meeting, but I have to wait 2 weeks to get the data. And that 2 weeks I waited to get the answer I didn't want to hear, which means I would have changed something else. And so you can quickly see
Yes.
how the OODA loop and then the speed at which information is put into an OODA loop is a loop for decision making.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the decision making loop, could you speed that up? And what would that mean for that M&A transaction? And how much impact and what is that worth? And you know, does that take away from the smarts of the lawyers and the impact they have, but does it bring a higher for the decision? And I think the more I think about, you know, that example, the more I can keep going deeper and deeper into it, right? Like, what if I created an agent that just was the chaos agent of figuring out, well, you know, Indonesia picks a fight with, you know, someone else, and, you know, then we suddenly have a mineral rules, or, you know, China comes in and tries to buy it. You just have like a chaos agent that's giving you all these scenarios that might happen, and none of them might. But
No.
you now have these well-researched sort of data sets that should something present to represent, or when you do your scenario analysis, there's a 2% of chance of this happening, and here's what the impact will be. And as a lawyer, that's your responsibility to calculate, you know, the associated risks and the trade-offs and the boundaries and what have you. And so I think nothing like it in the actual data, but like the decision intelligence has some similarities.
Yeah.
And that's where I see us helping, and I could give you others. So we're just starting to talk to some legal teams now. I think it's very fascinated as I start to understand where we could help, because I think right now the legal folks are like, oh, I'm going to have e-discovery and I get to search this thing and get all the tort law, and I think that's kind of a boring solve. Like, yes, we should have the data available and we should have a better Google and that should be a chatbot, yes. But like, what if we could make more efficient M&A decisions faster than our competitors?
Yeah. The more you explain it, the more it makes sense. It seems to me like it'd be an absolute no-brainer. It would cut their timeline down. I've worked on M&As, and like you say, everything gets dragged out to the nth degree, and everything is provided last minute. It absolutely seems like a no-brainer, and that I can see the connection because they're so regulated between that and pharma.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hopefully that gives you a little bit into, decision intelligence and a little bit into like applied AI systems. And, I haven't actually named a single model in this whole conversation. I mean, I think I said Anthropic and OpenAI when I was talking about some of the other stuff, but really not that technical at all. But I think what people should take away is they're probably closer than they think to applied AI. They're right to be skeptical of how to apply it, but they've got to find the right places. And so start with the simple, boring stuff, because that stuff is usually great exhaust, great data for other examples and other things to work with. And no one's going to be really upset if you take the thing they hate the most and fix it. And I think the other thing is, focus on the 10% at the end, that last mile. What is the most impactful? Like, it's all cool that we've got all these great tools, but what's the 10% that matters? And I think the last thing I would say is that, start today, own that thinking and get comfortable of understanding that, because if you don't, there is the risk. The only advantage we have of all resources being equal and time, ultimately the only advantage you have is time, when everyone will get access to these models, and that time should be used to create your own view or your own concentration on top. And I think if you take those three things away, you've got a better chance of success in going to our imaginary water park retirement home in 50 years' time.
Thank you so much, Nick, for joining today. It has been so insightful, and I'm sure our listeners are going to get some very useful information from today's session. So I would like to thank you so much for joining our podcast today.
Yeah, you're so very welcome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care.